Today we witness the most evil and heinous abuse of power in the history of our country.
That's right to the point. History made for all the wrong ways. Yesterday, as President Trump was arraigned and charged on 37 counts, no photos, no video, just sketches, his Bedminster speech, his defense plan as we know it, and what the rest of the GOP field thinks about Trump's troubles. We'll discuss it all. Professor Dershowitz, a big time in our history. Is this testing your constitutional knowledge?
Well, it's testing the Constitution. I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. There are a lot of things about the Constitution that nobody knows. For example, could a president pardon himself? Nobody knows the answer to that question. Must a public trial be on television? I think the answer to that is yes, but there's no authority for it. The framers of the Constitution wanted it as open as possible. Obviously, they allowed journalists to come in and townsfolk to come in to watch trials. I think we have to have this trial on television. Yesterday's proceeding should have been on television, and it wasn't. You know, it's interesting. I watched on two channels. I won't mention what they are. On one of them, the reporter said Trump was slumping. It looked like a defeated man. The other one said Trump was sitting up. His chest was out. He was defiant. This is the same incident. I think the American public have a right to see Trump's face, the judge's face, maybe not the juror's face, but all the evidence. Let's make our own judgment so we don't have to evaluate the case through the prism of often biased reporting. You know, it's interesting. In the OJ case, of course, I was involved in that, and it was on television. The people who watched it on television were less surprised by the verdict, by the outcome of the case that outraged so many people. But the people who watched it were less surprised than the people who read about it in the New York Times.
Understood. By the way, your book, Get Trump, outlines really what this whole process was, not specifically they're going to get him here and there. You just talked about the mission that they have to stop him before he gets another 4 years in office or stop him from even running for that office. Here's a little of President Trump's defense. We're starting to get a sense of what exactly he's facing and what he plans on saying. Cut 4.
As president, the law that applies to this case is not the Espionage Act, but very simply the Presidential Records Act, which is not even mentioned in this ridiculous 44-page indictment. Under the Presidential Records Act, which is civil, not criminal, I had every right to have these documents.
Is he right in saying that?
Well, it's interesting. In my book, Get Trump, I outline every one of the 4 cases against him. You know, the one in New York, which is the weakest case possible, outrageously weak, the one in New York. The one in D.C., which is being investigated, Fulton County is being investigated in Florida. And I said that I thought the strongest case would be an obstruction of justice case in Florida, that's what they were looking for, a process crime in Florida. And I was right. And I, went through all the evidence in the case. Look, it's the strongest case because of Trump's own statements. He said things to lawyers he shouldn't have said, and he said things to a writer that he had taped. It was his staff who taped them, in which he waves a paper and says, I could have declassified this, but I didn't. Now, we don't know what he waved because the paper is not in evidence, and maybe he was just bluffing and waving a piece of paper in order to make his point. But that is the strongest piece of evidence against him, that he was aware that the evidence was not declassified. Now, his position, he has 2 positions. Number one, he declassified everything. And number 2, the Presidential Record Act, which obviously follows the Espionage Act. By the way, nobody in court should be allowed to mention the word espionage. The act should not even be referenced by its name because espionage has nothing to do with this case. Nobody suggests that he turned anything over to Putin or turned anything over to Iran. There's no espionage involved in this case, and the word espionage is very prejudicial. So the first motion I would make if I was a defense lawyer is to strike the word espionage and warn the prosecution that if they ever use the word espionage, there'll be a mistrial. That's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is try to vacate the judgments that allowed the lawyers' statements to come in, because those judgments were made by D.C. lawyers. And what happened is Jack Smith went judge shopping, and he decided to bring the cases involving legal issues about whether the lawyer-client privilege has been voided in a favorable jurisdiction, the District of Columbia, and then move the case to Florida because he had to. And I would think that you should be able to relitigate that issue in the state, in the court in which the trial is going to be had. And that's a strong issue, whether or not Trump violated his lawyer-client privilege by asking his lawyers, wouldn't it be better if, wouldn't it be better if? Those are the kinds of questions that clients ask lawyers all the time.
Evan Corcoran is the attorney who the president was dealing with, right. And then they went ahead and said, you got to be a witness against your own client, at which time he gave devastating testimony. They looked at his text messages, and you know this all the time. Thankfully, I have not been in real trouble, but if you're my attorney, I'm going to be totally relaxed around you, and don't you want to be honest? Don't you want your client to be honest with you? Not knowing that at any moment, Alan Dershowitz could all of a sudden be forced to testify against his client while the client's paying him. And
I think that's an outrage, and I have to now give, as a result of this decision, I now have to give my clients a Miranda warning. I have to say to them before they speak to me, you have to read this decision of the D.C. Circuit, and you have to know that you can't say certain things to me. If you do, it violates the privilege. Of course, that will just shut up the client, and we'll make sure he doesn't say. Well, for example, clients have said to me over the years, wouldn't it be better if I ran off to Brazil? Now, I'm glad he asked me that question, because I say, no, it wouldn't. They'll get you, and they won't give you bail. And so please stay here and we'll fight the case. But clients ask you questions all the time. Wouldn't it be better if we made the piece of evidence disappear? No, they'll get you on obstruction. So you want to encourage those kinds of questions and the kinds of answers that lawyers should give. But now you can't ask those questions. You have to warn your client not to ask those questions.
So, Professor, what about this scenario? I'm your client, and I say, hey, could you do me a favor and go to the screen door and wipe my fingerprints off? Because I walked in the screen door, and they're going to say that I walked in there and killed her, but I just walk in the screen door. It's my house. So would you go do that? And let's say you go do that. Now you're playing a role in the crime. Couldn't you say that? And would you be susceptible to the same type of judge who says now you got to testify?
Yeah, there are cases like that. There's a famous case in New York where the lawyer asked the client, where'd you bury the body? And the client told him where he buried the body. And then they moved the body, so it shouldn't be found. Now, obviously, in a situation like that, the lawyer is complicit in the obstruction of justice. So lawyers have to be very careful.
Right.
But clients have to be even more careful, because it's not the lawyer who's being prosecuted here. It's the client who's being prosecuted based on what the lawyer said. But Jack Smith pulled off a very shrewd maneuver by getting rulings favorable to him in the District of Columbia instead of having those rulings made in Florida. And I think the courts might look a little askance at that. There'll be a lot of defenses raised, a lot of issues raised. I think, as I said, the first thing is no mention of the word espionage in that courtroom at all, because it will prejudice the jury beyond belief. When you hear espionage, what do you think? You think spying. You think, the Rosenbergs giving atomic secrets over to the Russians. The Espionage Act of 1917 may be the worst statute on the books today. Every liberal, every progressive, every Democrat, every civil libertarian has opposed it since 1917, when it was used to put war protesters in jail. Again, no espionage. They were just protesting the war. Now these same leftists, these same liberals are saying, wow, what a great statute. Let's expand it. Let's make sure it covers Donald Trump, and let's use the word espionage over and over and over again. It's such hypocrisy.
Right, and it gives Donald Trump supporters something to jump off on. Lastly, real quick, I know your book is Get Trump, but I got to get your legal take on this. Ted Cruz had the deputy FBI director in front of him, and he wanted to find out about this unclassified document with redactions that may have revealed under those redactions that there might be 17 tapes, 2 of which have Joe Biden talking to a Burisma executive. And listen to this deputy's answer and tell me if he is right. Cut 23.
I'm just not going to comment on information we received, investigations.
Do you owe an obligation to the American people to be candid about evidence of corruption by the President of the United States?
This is an area that I'm not going to get into with you, Senator.
Because you're stonewalling and covering up serious allegations of evidence of corruption from the President.
So he refused to answer what was redacted and refused to answer if there was tapes. Did the FBI director do the right thing, the deputy?
Well, first of all, you have to imagine how much fun it was for me to be teaching Ted Cruz, because he would, in class, say things like that too. He would accuse everybody in class of doing things. He was a great student because he was one of the few people who was prepared to stand up to me, to stand up to other professors. So it's important that we have somebody like Ted Cruz who really, really is tough. Ted Cruz is 100% correct, and the assistant director is 100% wrong. You can redact names of sources, you can do all those things, but Congress, an equal branch of government to the executive, has the absolute authority to show the American public any document, any tape recording, any 302, any form that would confirm allegations against the president, the former president. We need transparency. Americans don't trust the system. They don't trust the FBI. They don't trust judges. They don't trust anybody. We need to see it for ourselves. That's why the trial should be on television. These documents, redacted or unredacted, should be presented to the American public. Let us judge whether or not these alleged tape recordings exist and whether they incriminate or don't incriminate, and who they incriminate. What do you have to hide? Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
You know what they said, Professor? He said somebody could get killed. This is what he said. He goes, somebody could get killed if I tell you that.
Yeah, well, keep the name out, but don't keep the other information out. We've heard that excuse for years. You know, I was involved in the Pentagon Papers case. I was one of the lawyers in the Pentagon Papers case. The Solicitor General of the United States stood up and said that if the Pentagon Papers is revealed, people will be killed. And the Supreme Court listened to it. But they released the Pentagon Papers. Nobody was killed. It had no effect on our national security. The government cries wolf all the time when it comes to keeping material secret. 90% of material that's classified is not classified to protect the national interest. It's classified to protect the personal interest, the reputational interest of people who are classifying the material. So there's too much classification, too much secrecy, and not enough transparency. And in my book, Get Trump, I go through the whole issue of classification, the whole issue of how things should be disclosed, and the whole plot, essentially, to try to make sure that Trump doesn't run president. For example, we now have Rachel Maddow saying there ought to be a deal. The charges should be dropped if he only drops out of the presidential race, if he promises not to run for president. And some politicians have made the same point. What could be better evidence that the goal behind this is not to seek justice, it's to get Trump from running. Get Trump.
You can't do that. And Professor, would you join his legal team? Has he asked you?
I can't get into that, but I have a rule. I defend people only once, and I defended him once against unconstitutional impeachment. So I'm going to keep talking in the court of public opinion and trying to defend the Constitution, but he's going to have to get good lawyers. He's going to have a hard time getting good lawyers, because this Project 65 has threatened every lawyer who ever represented Trump with bringing bar charges. And when I said that I would represent anybody free who had a bar charge brought against them by Project 65, what do you think Project 65 did? They filed a bar charge against me, and they're doing it against everybody. And I've had 3 lawyers in the last couple of days call me and say they were asked to defend Trump, and they won't do it. They won't do it because they're frightened for their bar licenses. So this Project 65 has to be investigated and has to be put out of business. They're McCarthyites. They're just preventing Donald Trump from getting a fair trial. Professor
Alan Dershowitz, go out and get his book, Get Trump, The Threat to Civil Liberties, Due Process, and Our Constitutional Rule of Law. Thanks, Professor. Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.